The views and opinions expressed on the One Mark podcast are those of the authors or guests and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of One Mark. Any content provided by our guests or authors are of their own opinion and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything.
It is an executive function. So it is set up by a member of the executive. In many cases in South Africa, it was the president. And the purpose of that was to do fact-finding, right? So it follows an inquisitive process and what that, or inquisitorial process rather. And what that entails is basically...
Hello, Dumelang, Absheni, Sanbonani, Khoyatach, Molweni, Lochani. Welcome to the One Mark podcast, where we delve into real conversations about civil rights education. I am one of your hosts, Innocent Mohammed, Karibe Motswana Mo Africa Bora, and I am thrilled to have you join us as we embark on this beautiful educational journey. As usual, I am not alone. I am with my co-host.
Hello everybody and welcome Sanamugela to yet another episode of the One Mark podcast. My name is Mbali Mota. Dombi Mswati Lamvulani Nchebenkomo all the way from Mpumalanga. Thank you for joining us. We want this podcast to be a safe space for everyone to engage openly about civic education and service delivery issues. We hope to start conversations in your homes, in your cars, or wherever you are.
Yes, so Mbali, on today's episode of the podcast, we are going to be talking about corruption. Quite a very important conversation to be had, because in recent years we've seen that corruption has been rife in our country.
True.
Corruption really is a very devastating thing. Corruption is one of the biggest impediments on the country's growth and development, and it can take years, even decades, to undo the damage that is done and to rebuild a nation that is recovering from corruption. Not only does it undermine service delivery, but it also affects job creation and investor confidence. And lastly, it damages public trust in government. Bali, so how about you? How do you feel about corruption?
I mean, our government keeps on assuring us that they'll fight corruption, eradicate corruption. But how can we really trust this when any other day we keep on hearing about our leaders with their hands being caught in the cookie jar?
Yeah.
I mean, there are good systems in place in South Africa, the IDP being number one and the Constitution of South Africa. But it's quite evident that things have gone wrong because corruption has crept in.
Yeah.
I could go on and on for days rambling about my frustrations about corruption in South Africa. So before I do that, please let me introduce our guest today, Sanan, who is an advocate. Sanan, hello, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Mbali. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. Would you maybe just introduce yourself a little bit, just let our viewers and our listeners know who you are and what you do?
Yeah. Sure. So my name is Sanan Mirzoyev. I'm an advocate, currently practicing with Pabasa. And leading up to now, I'd done a few things in the anti-corruption space in particular. So I'll give you a really brief whistle-stop tour, but... after completing my degree, I'd worked at the Constitutional Court, and then after that was briefly in private practice, went over to the UK, did some studying there, came back to South Africa, and then I worked on the commission into the National Prosecuting Authority. So that was one of the commission of inquiries, one of the many, which I'm sure we'll discuss over the course of the discussion. And after that, then I landed a role leading up the anti-corruption program for the Southern African region for the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. So that was a few years, 3 years, before I then eventually made my way to the bar. So been in this space for quite a while, and happy to discuss all the intricacies.
Yeah, that's why we brought you here, and we're so happy that you can join us today. Let's get straight into it. The word corruption, we hear it on a daily basis. I mean, particularly in recent years, it's a word that actually exists in South Africa. But for those people that do not really know what corruption is, could you maybe just unpack what it is, and also the characteristics of countries that have corruption.
Okay, so two parts to that question. I think in terms of the first part, in terms of identifying what corruption is, I think it's important to distinguish between how we've politically come to understand corruption, which can be used as a broad umbrella term for any kind of misdeed or wrongdoing, especially when there's some sort of financial crime involved, right? But then there's the legal definition of corruption. So I'm not going to get you all stuck up in legalese. But as far as the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act goes, so that's the legislation we have in South Africa, the main piece of legislation. Corruption is effectively someone making use of their position, some kind of position, whether you have an advanced position due to office that you hold or particular status or privileges that you're given by law, and using that position in exchange for some sort of return benefit. So there's two aspects to it. There's the person that offers the benefit, and then there's the person that receives the benefit. And again, there's a lot of predicate offenses. We call them predicate offenses. They're offenses that are tied to corruption, but are not corruption themselves, right? So when someone does a corrupt act, there would normally be an element of money laundering involved, for instance. There may be an element of tax evasion involved. There may be an element of fraud involved. And I think that's why people often confuse, those predicate offenses with the actual offense of corruption, which is actually abusing your power to get some kind of benefit. Going to the second part of your question, what are the characteristics of countries that tend to have high levels of corruption? So I think this is a very interesting question because sitting in South Africa, you'd be forgiven for thinking that we are one of the most corrupt places. And I think it largely comes down to the public discourse, comes down to what you see in the media. You really get the sense that things are really bad. But I think when you look at what corruption looks like in the world, it takes many different forms. And there isn't really a good measure for the level of corruption that a society has. Okay. But the best we have at the moment is something that Transparency International do. Every year they release this thing called the Corruption Index, Corruption Perceptions Index, the CPI. And again, it's corruption perception, not actual corruption. But in terms of perceptions, you'll find that South Africa sits somewhere right in the middle. So we're actually 72 in the world. Number one is Denmark. When you go down to the bottom, you'll find, countries like Somalia and Sudan, Libya. So, you look at the characteristics that are common. I mean, it's quite difficult because I think one thing you need to dispel from the outset is that corruption is not a South African phenomenon. It is something that you find everywhere in the world. And even Denmark, which I mentioned was number one, just 5 years ago, there was a scandal that involved, nearly $500 billion US being laundered through one of its Danske Bank branches in Estonia. Right, so to suggest that somehow some country has got clean hands here, it isn't. It's a societal phenomenon all over the world, and I think if you were to look at what are the characteristics of countries that tend to have larger problems, right? Because I think where you can start distinguishing it is between societies where corruption is endemic, and societies where corruption happens in obviously crises, but they're sort of singular events that you can point to. But generally, the society doesn't condone it, right? And I think one of the main characteristics, if I were to try and venture a guess, because I don't think, it's quite complicated, but it would probably be a failure of accountability, a failure of institutions in a society, and ultimately a failure by society to hold individuals that are accused of corruption ultimately accountable. And that can take many different forms. That could be an institutional problem, that can be a social problem, that can be a political problem. So there are many different causes. And obviously, if we look at South Africa in particular, I mean, there's quite a lot to unpack there, but I'll let us get to that.
Yeah. Maybe let's just get into it. Please just give us a brief overview of the current state of corruption in South Africa, and how does it impact ordinary citizens like myself or someone else who's in Alex currently.
Okay. So I think when it comes to understanding what corruption is. I've given you sort of the legal definition of it, right? But there's a further classification that tends to take place where, many civil societies and policy think tanks have come to understand that corruption doesn't, there isn't just there's this umbrella term, but you get specific types. So you get petty corruption, Right? Petty corruption is what you may experience on the street, where a police officer might extort a bribe in return for letting you off the hook if you're caught speeding, or little things. Cash for jobs is a phenomenon we see in our education sector, in the health sector. The kind of situations that arise there where people may pay to jump the line. And then you get higher levels of corruption, right, where it's more systemic and typically involves people that are in more powerful political positions, right? That's called grand corruption. So grand corruption, obviously in South Africa, everyone who has seen the news will be quite familiar with what has been happening on that level. And we've even taken it to the point of state capture, which is something quite different. But how it affects everyone, right? First of all, historically, it's always been accepted that corruption often, particularly when we're talking about grand corruption, right? That is the use of public funds often in some sort of beneficial way for the individual that holds political high office, and obviously the individual that is somehow benefiting from that contract, for instance. And what that basically means is that you have that tax money that could have been going into building 10 houses, 10 RDP houses. But now, because of inflated costs, rent extraction, various, we call them kickbacks colloquially in South Africa, because of all that's happening, you can only build one house. So now 9 families are left without a home for the price of one, right? And that is really on the ground how those effects are felt, right? I think we all know in South Africa, load shedding is a daily phenomenon for all of us, right? But the truth is that corruption affects the vulnerable parts of society the most, right? Because your middle class, your privileged class can buy their way out of it, right? Oh, okay, the power's out. I have a solar panel. There's a generator. We're fine. But there's people, the vulnerable groups in society, have to face the reality and the impacts that has every single day. And so, it's hard to say, directly, okay, corruption. People often talk about it colloquially, like, it's time to eat, in political discourse. It's often people will say that. And, that really strikes me at the core because, people, yes, on the surface, it can be like, okay, well, this guy is doing it and it doesn't really hurt anyone because, it's just contracts, it's all pie in the sky. But when you look at the aggregate effect of all of it, it means that the society starts to fail and it starts to fail its citizens. And I think in a place like South Africa, especially, given the challenges that we've always faced, it's especially something that can't be allowed, something that can't be countenanced, because we have a lot of things that we have to deal with. I think I'll maybe just pause to add, and you can stop me if I'm getting carried away.
All right.
But, corruption is not a phenomenon that we've just seen, post-democratic South Africa, right? Corruption has always been an issue here. Under the National Party, there was strong favoritism that was being or given out under nationalistic auspices, right? So to suggest that that's somehow something that's arisen now, it's not true. But it has gotten to levels that are unsustainable for the country. And that is where I think we have to sort of draw that line and say that, yes, it's always been a problem here, but it's become such a problem that it's actually stopping our society from reaching what it needs to reach and being what it needs to be.
You mentioned there state capture briefly,
yes,
and the different types of corruption. So I want us to go back to state capture because I think arguably it is one of the biggest corruption cases that everybody is familiar with. Can you just unpack what exactly is the state capture and what led to that, and what was actually the conclusion of the state capture?
Yeah, so state capture, it's an interesting term that we've coined to describe, the phenomenon of what happened under the previous administration in South Africa. I think what distinguishes state capture from, for instance, grand corruption, they're very similar. But grand corruption, as I mentioned before, involves some high-powered political figures who use that influence then to rig the system in their favor, right? State capture takes us one step further because it is a systematic dismantling of institutions within a society. Now, I'm going to unpack that because there's a lot of words there.
Yeah.
So what that basically means is you have the way democracy functions is through checks and balances, right? We call them checks and balances. You have, for instance, you have the executive arm of state with the president and the cabinet. Yeah. You have the legislative arm of state with, parliament making laws. You have the judiciary, basically making sure that the laws are being followed, right? The way democracy works is by all these different parts of the state keeping one another accountable. Right, and to add it to that, you then have law enforcement. For instance, there's the police that will investigate wrongdoing. There's the prosecutorial authority that will take it to court and make sure that individuals are put in jail where they do things wrong. Yeah. So what state capture is, it is looking at all those different institutions that are meant to keep one another in balance, and effectively putting individuals into those institutions to the point that you allow those institutions to effectively be captured. We call them captured. But what that means is that you allow those institutions stop functioning. And because they stop functioning, accountability starts to fade. And that's really, where, we use a lot of terms in South Africa, cronyism and nepotism and cadre deployment. There's a lot of different words for it. But what it effectively means is putting individuals into positions which maybe they're not prepared to be put into. Some people often think that it's this idea of, some really evil plan where someone sits in a big room with all these individuals and saying, now we're going to go deploy this massive scheme, right? Yeah. But that isn't always the case. A lot of the times you get individuals that maybe aren't prepared to hold a particular office, right? Who maybe aren't skilled enough or haven't been trained enough and are put into this very senior position and now are told that, like, okay, this is your job. But then there's this political figure that maybe appears in your room every now and then and tells you that this is what you should do. And because you're not experienced, because you don't know what your exact function is, and you follow instructions, right? And through that, then that's when the capacity of the state dwindles and the institution starts to fail. And then you stop holding actors accountable. And that is, I think there's a lot more elements to it, which, we don't need to unpack now. But I think, state capture is effectively making institutions fail, so that you can then get away without being held accountable by doing certain actions.
Yeah. I just want to ask, in your own perspective, do you think that the leaders that we have elected into power are experienced enough to be able to hold the position that they do? That's one question. My other question is, how do citizens in the ground hold the leaders accountable that we have elected into power?
So it's an interesting question. I mean, I think in terms of asking whether political leaders that are elected can hold that position, I think that's a bit of a tricky one to answer because, in a democracy, you elect your leaders. Yeah. Right? And so ultimately, whether you like the leader or you don't like the leader or you think that leader is competent or not, the leader is a reflection of society's will, right? In a functioning democracy, at least, right? We have a lot of democracies in the world that call themselves democracies, but they're not really democracies. But obviously, when it comes to political accountability, that is, I mean, we'll get to that point, I'm sure. But the point where how actors in civil society and ordinary civilians, civic action, holds leadership accountable. I wouldn't say that you need to be, a particular individual to hold political office in South Africa. Yeah. But I think where we do start to see slippage is when we allow policies of the state to be bent to the whims of political leaders, right? That means our institutions aren't strong enough to hold political actors accountable, right? I think going to your second or to the second part of your question, I think you might just need to remind me on that because it's now slipped my mind.
The first part was about accountability at local level, right?
Yes.
And my second part of the question was, what I'm really trying to ask is that you did mention in your statement saying that sometimes you feel people are not fit enough or competent enough to hold office. Is there maybe a criteria there that we can use to make sure that the people that we elect into power are competent to hold these positions because we entrust them with so much?
Okay, so on that particular point, let me just sort of qualify what I'm saying in terms of individuals holding offices, right? Okay, yeah. Not every office that I talk about is a political office, right? Yes. So a political office is the product of an election, a democratic process where, I mean, in South Africa, we have party representation. So parties then choose the leaders who then go and hold these political offices, right? The offices that I speak of at an institutional level are, for instance, and again, we want to sort of tread carefully here in terms of how we level allegations. But, holding an office would be someone who's a civil servant. So someone who isn't elected, someone who joins the public service and who gets promoted through the public service and eventually finds themselves holding a particular position, right? And the thing is about holding a senior position in government is that with that comes a whole barrage of accountability and responsibilities. And again, I think to also say that, it's solely the responsibility of leadership that we have an issue of corruption in South Africa, that would be completely wrong, right? Problem with corruption in South Africa is that it's endemic. It appears on every level, right? And I think that's, again, we could. There's a lot of studies that could be done into identifying why that is, and there's studies that have been done. In South Africa, we have particular issues with inequality. And inequality drives desperation, right? And desperation, then, individuals find themselves with an opportunity to earn a salary. And one's decision to try and climb the ladder might be driven by that motivation, as opposed to, what is this job that I'm stepping into? Am I prepared to do this job? Do I understand that, failure to do this job has these repercussions for our society? So there are those distinctions, right? But again, boiling it all down to, individuals occupying offices, no, like that would be an incorrect characterization of how the phenomenon of state capture is played out. Right. But I think one of the characteristics would be that, there has been whittling down of state institutions. So, sorry, I think I may have gone off the path there, but hopefully we can get back on track.
Not necessarily. We kind of like it, actually. Let's talk about now institutions. We have different institutions that I think you also mentioned that you have actually worked at some of the anti-corruption institutions. I want to particularly focus on one that is called the National Anti-Corruption Strategy that was adopted in 2020.
Yes.
What exactly is the role of such an organization?
Right. So the National Anti-Corruption Strategy was actually, it's a strategic document that was adopted by the government, so by the executive. And the role of the strategy was to effectively set a path for South Africa in terms of how it wants to now structure its efforts to fight corruption. Right. So it's not an organization per se. It's more of a strategic policy, right? And then in order to implement that policy, various stakeholders have been brought together to try and figure out how do we achieve this goal, right? So, I mean, we have other policies like there's the National Development Plan, for instance. So NACS is on the same level as that, right? One of the phenomenons of NACS is that they established what's called the National Anti-Corruption Advisory Council, right? NACAC, lots of acronyms. So NACAC's function is it's comprised of individuals from across society. So it's not just government officials or bureaucrats that sit there. You have members of civil society. You have members from academia. So it's really a cross-section of South Africa. And what they're there to do is effectively to look at some of the issues. And I know that the Zondo Commission into State Capture was really one of their main focus areas. And to look at the recommendations there and basically to come up with policy suggestions to the president, which can then be implemented. So, I mean, it's all very technical and bureaucratic, but really what its function is, what NACS's function is to set a vision for South Africa as to what we want to achieve. I think as far as the person on the ground goes, it's not going to make any difference overnight. It's certainly not sort of a panacea to solve all our social ills. But what it aims to do is over time, with different institutions focusing to achieve those strategic objectives, then eventually some sort of change is achieved, right? And I mean, that's typically how government functions. Government doesn't, overnight, bring all the corrupt people here and, we deal with them, Institutional change takes place over a prolonged period of time. Yeah. And so that's what the strategy is there to do, because once a strategy is set, then all the different government departments that are involved in fighting corruption. So in South Africa, that could be, the hawks within the police. That could be, so the hawks that's a colloquial term for the Directorate for Priority Crimes Investigations. It could be the investigative directorate within the National Prosecuting Authority. It could be a special commercialized crimes unit within the National Prosecuting Authority. It could be SARS. It could be various different entities in the country that are involved in this. FIC, the Financial Intelligence Center, who gather financial and forensic reports from the private sector, from the banks. and the other regulated sectors. So all of those entities will now look at the strategy, and when they're creating their own within their department, their departmental strategy, they will then base their strategy on that strategy. And then that's how that organization then tries to carry out its function. So that's where NACS fits into it. It's a really high-level ambition, which then everyone tries to implement, and their performance is then assessed.
Based on the strategy that has been implemented by NACS, I just wanted to find out from you, are there any successful stories that have been implemented or resolved by NACS?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's an interesting question because, often departments then will report on how they're implementing the strategy. Yeah. I think the idea of NACAC, which has arisen, and I mean, if we're going to check from when NACS was implemented in 2020. So I think I need to double check my figures, but I think it was 2021, 2021, I think, when NACAC was convened. So I think that in itself was a bit of an achievement because, under the previous administration, one of the key features of South Africa is that it seemed like it was government against everyone else, right? It was civil society and government had a very bad relationship, right? Civil society was, pointing out a lot of issues. Yeah. Government was fighting tooth and nail to say that there wasn't any problem, and then finally capitulated towards 2017 when Ramaphosa came to power and said, okay, look, actually, it's been pretty bad. So the relationship between the different stakeholders in society wasn't great. And the creation of NACAC, I think in itself is, an acknowledgement that the only way we're going to fight this is by all coming together and trying to figure out what we do about this, right? So I think, again, it's very high level. And as far as, the person on the street goes, it's not really, okay, great, this great thing is happening in government. But I think the actual effects of it would be felt, further down the line. At this point, it's still a lot of, mapping exercises that have been taking place. They're trying to see, government is a big and complex beast, and everyone is trying to see what are the different working and moving parts, who's involved in fighting corruption, who's in speaking to the other person, which is leading us to this position now where things aren't getting done. So a lot of the discussion up to now, at least on what I've been keeping abreast with, has been just trying to do a mapping of what's going on and figure out what sort of high-level recommendations can be made to the president, which can then be implemented. So pretty slow moving. And I mean, I think that's pretty much par for the course as far as sort of how government change takes place from a policy level.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned again that, such strategies, we're going to reap the benefits of them, in a long term. And then for us citizens, ordinary citizens, if we want to hold our leaders accountable, for example, whistleblowers, we've seen that there are many situations where whistleblowers lack protection. I mean, we've seen, in different forms of media, it's been reported, people get fired, people are intimidated, and just for telling the truth and actually reporting corruption. Are there any ways that whistleblowers can be protected? Is it in the Constitution? In fact, let me ask it that way. Is it in the Constitution? How do we eliminate the culture of fear for people who want to actually report corruption? Because we've seen, there is a lot of intimidation, there's a lot of fear around it, there's a lot of consequences that are very negative. So is the law protecting whistleblowers?
Yes, so, so I sort of understood your question in two parts. The first was, what do ordinary citizens do, in response to corruption?
Yes.
And the second part is, when it comes to whistleblowers in particular, what is being done and how are they protected? So I think to go to the first part of your question, effectively, citizens need to ultimately begin with change at home, at least in my view, right? I think it doesn't help to point fingers at grand corruption happening in society and in the media headlines whilst, every other day there's some acquaintance recalling a story of how a police officer was given 500 Rand and or some cool drink, and then the person proceeded with their day, right? And I think, that's where people need to start taking a principled stand, right? And that only comes from understanding that if we allow these everyday occurrences to just slip past us, and if we continue to just celebrate individuals who manage to accrue crazy amounts of wealth without understanding where they got that wealth from, for instance, right? Then effectively we get into a situation where our society stops functioning properly, right? It really is. It's a collective responsibility, and it's quite complicated to try and say this is the solution. But I think that individuals need to understand what the problem is, and they need to understand why it's important that all of us work together to try and solve the problem. When it comes to your point of whistleblowers, I mean, this has been a very big issue. In South Africa, all over the world, there's a big push now to try and see how are we protecting whistleblowers. So there was the Protected Disclosures Act in South Africa, and that was largely modeled on the UK legislation, which came out in 1998. And the thing is, in the UK, the way they had approached their whistleblower protection was mainly around securing the employment protection of an individual. So basically saying if you come forward and you make some kind of protected disclosure, which is what they call, blowing the whistle effectively, then your job is protected and your statement is protected. So you can't have any negative repercussions that flow from you making this revelation, right? But that often doesn't go far enough. Right, and particularly in South Africa, what we've seen is that tied to these cases of grand corruption has also been instances of organized crime, violent crime. And so, just saying that your job is safe isn't enough. And also realistically on the ground, yes, you could say that this person came forward and said, hey, people are doing something wrong here. Yeah. And you could say that your job is protected legally. But let's think of what it's like going into the office on Monday, and now everyone thinks that you're you betrayed the team, everyone was working on this together, and South Africa has a particularly difficult history when it comes to, this idea of individuals coming forward or, historically in South Africa, Mpimpis and Askaris during apartheid, I think a lot of that leads as, we're all in this together, and if people are doing something wrong, then everyone needs to, play their part and not speak out. So it's a big issue. I think there's a social change that needs to happen. First of all, we need to stop treating whistleblowers and ostracizing them and treating them like they're people that aren't being part of the team. In fact, they're the heroes of our society. They're the ones that are protecting the greater public, and not just that specific group that they find themselves in. And then, beyond that, employment protection is great, but we need to look at how we're keeping these individuals safe. And I think that's particularly a phenomenon in South Africa. I think anecdotally, when I was working on an inquiry, we would have individuals coming in, and yes, there was police officers at the entrance, right? But once you leave the entrance and you get into your car,
you're alone.
You're out there, right? And so particularly in a violent society such as our own, we really need to think about how we're keeping individuals safe. I mean, it gives me comfort to know that there's a lot of organizations that are really looking at this. And we have institutes, there's the Whistleblower House that's been set up to try and protect many of the individuals that came forward during state capture. But I mean, many individuals are ostracized. Some have, those that could afford to have gone overseas to try and stay safe. Others live in fear. So we really need to start changing how our society deals with that. And I mean, in my mind, there's a lot more of us than there are of them. So collectively we should be doing more to try and ensure that these individuals are celebrated, but also protected, because they are the ones that are the only ones that are allowing us to fight this thing in any way, shape, or form.
I just wanted to find out. There's so many systems in place. You mentioned earlier the state capture being one of them, to hold our leaders accountable. So why are there so few successful stories about corruption?
Right, so I'm assuming you're referring to the State Capture Commission and the various commissions. Yeah. So, I think it's interesting because one needs to understand what a commission is, what a commission of inquiry does, right? And one needs to understand that when it comes to a commission of inquiry, yes, there's an element of accountability, but the accountability mainly comes from the fact that the issues are being ventilated. So what it really is, it's a fact-finding exercise, right? Yeah. Now, there's many, again, you can get very philosophical and academic on this, but I'm going to save you that. What it really is, it is set up by the executive, right? So it's set up in terms of the Commissions Act. And its job then, there's a person that's appointed to chair the inquiry. and then facts are presented in the inquiry. It's supposed to be an inquisitorial process. So it's really just about establishing what are the facts. And then after the facts are established, prepare a report.
Okay.
Now, the test that they use in terms of the evidence that's presented in a commission of inquiry,
Yeah.
it's called the reasonable suspicion or balance of probabilities. They particularly in the Zondo Commission, it seems to have oscillated between the two. In some cases there was reasonable suspicion as a test. In other cases there was balance of probabilities. Once that report is prepared,
Yeah.
that is now a document that has information, right? And the idea is that with that information, the public is aware of what transpired. What that document can then also be used to do is to help government then formulate policy, because it creates an official position for government. Now you can say, this is what happened, and based on that, we're now going to pass law X, Y, and Z, or we're going to start formulating law X, Y, and Z. So, good example, Zondo Commission, they said, we need better whistleblower protection. So now people are looking at better whistleblower protection laws. People said we need better procurement laws. People are looking at what you do about that. People said we need better institutions in the state that can fight corruption. Now they're looking at whether we need to have a new anti-corruption body or whether we need to better coordinate our existing anti-corruption bodies. So that's really what a commission does. And I think that's often where people feel a bit hard done by, because they expect that now that we've said all this damning evidence has come forward and all these allegations were made, let's set up the guillotine in the public square and go about this French Revolution style, And that's not how it works, right? Obviously, I'm being a bit facetious. But the truth is, that's only the start of a much longer process.
Yeah.
Now that you've got these facts, that's the executive having done what it needed to do for its own policies and how it then goes about doing its thing. But now when we talk about holding individuals accountable, putting them in jail or seizing assets, that's a completely different part of the state that has to do that.
Okay.
Right? You get the investigative function, so you get your police, your hawks, your investigative directorate does a bit of a hybrid thing, but I won't get into that now. But they now have to go and start looking at, the evidence that was covered in the inquiry is great. You can use that to help propel, but you need to prove something, different, because now we're talking about criminal liability, for instance, in a criminal case. Now you need to prove your case beyond reasonable doubt. So now you have a police officer that needs to go and investigate. And say, for instance, you can show that, person X bought himself a bunch of Ferraris after person X's company won a big state tender. It's great to put that on record in a commission of inquiry. But now you have to prove that in court. You're going to have to show how this tender was awarded to this company. This company would have probably, paid out consultants. In the UK, obviously, we've modeled our legislation on the UK approach, which, that legislation was crafted in 1998. And in the UK, the focus was largely on protecting employment. So effectively, if you were to come forward and blow the whistle or to expose some misdealings which were happening within the particular company, the idea was that disclosure would be protected, and there could be no ramifications or repercussions to that individual in terms of their employment. So you can't demote them, you can't try fire them, whatever the case may be. And so a lot of the world's legislation, let me not say the world, but at least in South Africa, we've largely modeled our approach on that. So we've got that Protected Disclosures Act here. And again, what we've seen is that simply protecting employment isn't often sufficient, right? You need to, particularly in our context, what we've seen is that individuals often face real threats to their lives. And there's many different aspects to this, right? So for instance, in South Africa, we have a particularly difficult history in light of apartheid, where individuals who would come forward or share information were Askaris or Mpimpis, and societies would ostracize them and often do violent acts, and that's largely carried across into the corporate environment. Again, across all groups, but the idea is that you're in a team and that everyone needs to be part of that team. And if you step forward to point out something that's gone wrong, then you face the repercussions of the group. And it's great to say that there's legislation that says your employment can be protected, but you have to deal with the social repercussions of that. You have to go into that office on Monday. Beyond that, when we start talking about organized crime, which we've seen in South Africa, in case of state capture, there's been a large cut across between or crossover between organized crime activities and what's been happening there, and serious threats of violence to individuals' lives. We have a complete gap in the law on that front. So there's quite a bit of work to be done to see how do we protect individuals in South Africa to ensure that their lives can be kept safe, their families can be kept safe. Beyond that, their employment, what happens on that front? You've got the Protected Disclosures Act, but how do you ensure that rather than just saying that society can tolerate whistleblowers, that we're actually actively trying to ensure that they're protected? And again, there's a social element to this as well. Someone that comes forward to blow the whistle isn't a traitor, isn't someone who's betrayed the team. Someone who's come forward to blow the whistle is a hero because they understand that what benefits society as a whole and what is beneficial to South Africa far surpasses any benefit that can be obtained by this particular group that is doing something wrong. So I think there's a few changes that need to take place, and I take some comfort in knowing that we have some really progressive approaches being taken by various civil societies and groups. And, Whistleblower House was established for purposes of protecting many of the individuals who came forward during state capture. So, it's happening, but it is slow. And again, some change needs to take place drastically. And I think particularly now, we have some individuals who've been forced to flee overseas where they're in a privileged enough position where they could afford to do so. Others are in South Africa. You get certain individuals who sort of gain prominence or public profile, and they get some sort of position in the private sector or whatever the case may be. But you get many others who just fall into poverty effectively. And that's something that we really need to be conscious of and be more proactive in terms of addressing. And I mean, I know the Zondo Commission pointed out whistleblower protection as being one of the key issues that need to be focused on moving forward in government.
I mean, with so many attempts trying to fight off corruption, you've mentioned the Zondo Commission, and we've seen so many other cases being investigated. Why has there been so few attempts to fight off corruption then?
Yeah. So, I mean, let me start by saying that fighting corruption is hard work, right? Of the crimes that you get, corruption is probably one of the most complex, and all the predicate crimes that are associated with corruption are also some of the most complex crimes to investigate and to prosecute. So before we get to that, let's look at what commissions are, right? So you mentioned the commission into state capture. There's various others. There was the Nugent Commission of Inquiry into tax affairs at SARS. There was the Commission of Inquiry into there was the arms deal. There's various ones that took place in South Africa, and particularly under the Ramaphosa administration. And what a commission is, it is an executive function. So it is set up by a member of the executive. In many cases in South Africa, it was the president. And the purpose of that was to do fact-finding, right? So it follows an inquisitive process, and what that, or inquisitorial process, rather. And what that entails is basically there's a chairperson that's appointed, there's maybe a panel, and there's evidence leaders, and evidence leaders come forward, and they basically want to place the facts in front of this commission. And the standard, the evidential standard that is used is the standard of reasonable suspicion. In some cases, in other cases, they've used balance of probabilities. And really what they're doing is they're creating a story, creating a narrative of what transpired. Now, once that evidence process has been completed, then there's a report that's compiled. And on the strength of that report, then government can take that and can use it to formulate its policies. So it then creates an official position for government, because it's all good and well that there's media reports saying X, Y, and Z happened. But until a commission has happened, you don't have an official position for government from which it can then formulate its policies. But, when it comes to the question of accountability for individuals, so someone who's made a lot of money off of tender procurement fraud, or someone who needs to go to jail because they've done something else corrupt. then we're dealing with something completely different, a different part of government. It's no longer, within the wheelhouse of an executive commission of inquiry.
Right.
Now you need to have a full-blown investigation that would typically be carried out by someone like the DPCI, the Hawks, within the SAPS. Then once the investigation is complete, then that would need to go over to be prosecuted within the National Prosecuting Authority. And then that needs to go to court. Yeah. And then in court, the standard isn't balance of probabilities or reasonable suspicion. It's beyond reasonable doubt. Okay. And it's far more complicated to prove that because you basically need to show that this particular version that the state has put forward through its investigation is the only reasonable version of what could have happened. And I think, there have been many cases of how that's then failed, especially in our sort of recent headlines. Yeah. We know what happened with the extradition of the Guptas, for instance. There were some rudimentary issues there where, for instance, our government had perhaps overlooked appointing a attorney or a law firm to go and sit and watch the proceedings while they were happening to ensure that anything that was going wrong, that there was, objections or some sort of intervention that could happen. That was a bit more of a rudimentary error. But we can look at the more recent case that happened. I think it was in August, or was it April? Sorry, dates are escaping me now. But it was effectively the first of the state capture prosecutions. They called it that, right? And basically what had happened there, that was the Nulani investment fraud, which then eventually led to the Vrede dairy farm scandal, right? Yeah. And basically what went wrong there was, the judge said that they had rushed to bring this case to court and they didn't have the evidence that they required. It wasn't an offense under the Prevention and Combating of Corrupt Activities Act that was being prosecuted there. It was, in fact, a bunch of, as we were saying, predicate offenses. So here it was violations of the Public Finance Management Act. There was an allegation of fraud. There was a few accusations of money laundering on the charge sheet. And with all those charges, the state effectively conceded that the PFMA, there wasn't enough evidence to prove that there was non-compliance with the PFMA. There wasn't enough evidence to show that fraud had taken place. And there wasn't evidence to show that there was money laundering. So all 8 of the accused got acquitted at the early stage when the state had closed its case. And I think that just goes to show that just because we managed to get some version from a report in a commission of inquiry doesn't mean that we've got enough information to secure successful conviction. Coupled with that, you have to remember that when it comes to putting people in jail, they're going to lawyer up. And, I have 2 mantras that I follow, and maybe this is a little bit more relaxed, but the first is, people who spend money like they've stolen it often have. Okay. That's my one, sort of generalization. And the second one is that fighting corruption takes a very long time. Yeah. And because these individuals have maybe acquired a lot of resources, they can often hire the best lawyers, right? Yeah, and that can make the process take very long. Even countries that arguably have really well-functioning institutions, I look at the UK as an example. Some of their corruption cases take up to 10 years to finalize. And obviously the South African public, doesn't want to see 10 years before, someone starts going down for state capture. And I think that's the tension that the National Prosecuting Authority has right now. It's sort of balancing the public expectation of heads rolling versus, the reality that this is really hard to investigate and this is really hard to prosecute. And then couple that with the fact that we have state institutions that have been deliberately dismantled and crippled over many years. Rebuilding that capacity is its own process that you need to deal with, its own challenge that you need to deal with before you even turn to the question of successfully prosecuting individuals.
The SIU was administered to look into corrupt activities during that time, during the national disaster state. And they found that there were 164 contracts that totaled into billions and billions of money. Why is it? Tell me, why is it that at the time that our country was most vulnerable, that people needed help, that our leaders thought it was a great opportunity to take money and let people suffer?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, what causes individuals to be corrupt is, quite topical, and I think again a lot of research has been done into that question in terms of behavioral psychology. You know, what causes a person to want to do that? I mean, you know, first of all, you can say that crisis breeds opportunity, right? If there's load shedding, well, guys who are selling solar panels are having a good time, right? So similarly, when COVID-19 hit, one of the big issues that we had, so during state capture, we know that a lot of the problems were taking place through the state-owned entities. And there was a very specific reason for that. Because state-owned entities, while they are subject to certain laws that apply to government departments, they have a slightly more hybrid function because they can interact in many respects like a private entity, like a private company. And so it makes it a lot easier to move money out of the state when you're bailing out a state-owned entity that's failing, and then that money is then being used to enter into all sorts of dubious contracts, which then ultimately end up in the pockets of individuals who are benefiting. Now, when COVID hit, because it was a crisis and things needed to happen very quickly, National Treasury effectively relaxed a lot of the rules and regulations that apply to public procurement. So departments often have to take longer than a state-owned entity, for instance, to conclude certain contracts because there's a lot of compliance processes that they have to follow in terms of the law. With COVID and the sort of emergency procurement regulations that were passed, now suddenly all government departments could acquire things very quickly. And they didn't have to meet all the same compliance requirements. So now suddenly individuals that would have had to, you know, do deviation requests from National Treasury and get approvals and things could suddenly go straight to market. And another phenomenon you saw is all these fly-by-nights because, you know, before no one was producing hand sanitizers on mass scale or masks. Now suddenly a company could be incorporated and then a week later they are producing all these masks, right? And so you can see that all the ingredients were there for all sorts of dodgy dealings. And again, I mean, you know, in terms of conscionably, what allows a person to say that this is a good idea when our people are suffering, I mean, you know, I guess that's why it makes us so angry. And it makes people so upset when they hear about corruption, right? Because it's, how can you do this?
How can you do that?
And I mean, I guess there's a more philosophical point behind it, but you're probably going to need a separate podcast for it. About, you know, what sort of incentives do we have in society? You know, are we placing getting rich quick above anything else? And do we prize that? You know, is my ability to drive a Range Rover more important than, you know, how I am interacting with my community every day? And if our society says that, yes, that's more important, then, you know, it's understandable why certain individuals find that it's, you know, okay to do it. And I mean, again, going back to the fact of people don't always appreciate what effect corruption has on the society, or they think that it's this big pie in the sky idea. And it doesn't really matter because really, you know, government's collecting money from tax gets wasted all the tax, you know, payers' money gets wasted all the time in government and all sorts of silly things. So what's wrong if I, you know, shave off a few million here or a few million there? Maybe that's the reason. I can't tell you for sure.
But thank you so much. So as we wrap up, you mentioned ranking, that South Africa is ranking at number 72, I think.
That's right.
But then it means that there are other countries that are actually doing well. Are there any examples of countries that have successfully fought corruption? And what can we learn as South Africa from them?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I think, you know, going back to my point that every country has issues with corruption. And it's not just a South Africa thing. But I think what you can do, you know, given our position, there's certain things that we need to acknowledge, right? The reason why we believe corruption is so bad in South Africa, perhaps some of the worst in the world, is the reason, you know, is the very same reason why we're ranked so highly, is the fact that we have a very robust civil society, we have a very free media, we have a very independent judiciary. You know, those ingredients, we need to appreciate that those are really good things that we have going for us, and we need to make sure that we maintain that, right? That's the thing about what we have in South Africa, is that, you know, anything that we achieve through our constitution, through our democracy, these are things that we have to continuously fight for. When it comes to looking at examples in other countries, I mean, there's a lot of best practices that we can try and learn from. You know, a good example is how our different corruption fighting bodies are structured in the state. We can look at examples overseas. You know, there have been some good examples, for instance, in Kenya on how they're coordinating that. There's good examples in the UK. But again, you have to look at circumstance as well. So it's not always appropriate to say, okay, what is the US doing to fight corruption, and how can we, emulate the SEC or different types of entities that they have there, right? Or anti-corruption bodies within the FBI, because they have different resources, they have a different context, they have completely different society. So I think what we can do from countries that are arguably performing better than us on a perceptions index is we can look at what they're doing and what aspects of their society are functioning better than others. Maybe we can see that in certain places the political accountability is higher. There's more democratic accountability. People are going to vote when politicians let them down. That can be a good example, and say, okay, well, how do we galvanize people then to vote when they're unhappy? There's so many disenchanted youth in South Africa who just don't vote. Because they think, well, it's never going to change anyway. It's terrible. I hate it. But there's nothing I can do about it. We need to change that, because accountability, as I said before, is one of the key common denominators that I sort of at least identified in countries that really struggle with corruption, is because you can't tell that person who did something wrong that this was wrong and this is what's going to happen now. And if you can't get that wrong, if you can't get that right, then obviously, that's something you have to address, and that's something we could probably learn from others.
Yeah. As my close-off question, I just want to say, as we count down to 2024 national and provincial elections, what message would you like to share with our viewers today?
Well, I think it's really important, and that's actually a great question to end with, because that kind of tails off what I just said. But I think it's really important that, first of all, everyone needs to understand that your voice does count.
Yes.
You have to, it's often lost on our generation, perhaps, and many others who weren't here at the time when so much was being sacrificed so that we could have a constitutional democracy, what we have today.
Yeah.
And people don't understand that once you achieve it, it's not a finish line. It's a milestone. But it's not the top of the mountain. To keep a democracy functioning, to keep a constitutional state going, you have to keep fighting for it. And so for that means that everyone needs to understand that there's a responsibility that they have. And the best thing that you can do as a citizen is to vote, and is to vote your conscience. And I mean, look, I'm not going to get into the politics of it all, because I think many young people in South Africa feel quite politically disenchanted, and I'd probably include myself in that class of people. But, that is where we can start. Start holding our leaders accountable, start making sure that they don't feel like they can do things and just completely get away with it, right? And that starts with voting. That's at least what you can do as a ordinary citizen. And then start looking at what you can do at home. How are you addressing your community? How are you involved in your community? A lot of active citizenry starts at home.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know if that's directly tied to the election, but I'm sure that's I think, a pretty important part of making our society function.
There you have it, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today's episode. Please make sure that you do not miss another episode, and make sure that you follow us on our socials. Follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, and Twitter.
Yes, and as we are closing off, thank you again, Sanan, for coming today. And I hope that you have learned lessons today. And what is important and what we took from him is that accountability and transparency is key. Until then, stay engaged and stay curious. And together, let's unlock the power of knowing our rights. Goodbye.